Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers. In today's episode of this Arctic Forest creation series, I'll show you how to create two types of mist. A planar mist that's suitable for cinematic use, and a more three-dimensional volumetric mist that's better suited for in-game usage. So let's get straight into it. Here are my reference images for the Arctic Forest, and you can see in these three images at the bottom right, I found ones with sort of low-lying clouds, fog and mist. So this is the sort of effect I'm looking for. Probably not quite this strength, but I want to create this sort of mist and fog that lies at the ground level. So let's start off by creating a planar variety of the mist. Let's set up the components of our mist, starting off with the material. So if you go into your content browser and find the materials folder that you created in the first lesson or second lesson, we'll create a new material here. So right click and select material, and I'm going to call it M_planar mist. And if I open that up, I'll just dock it at the moment so we can see everything. First of all, we have to choose the material type here. So at the moment it's an opaque material, but if you change that to an additive material, what that means is that any black in the color will be see-through, and then any color above black will be opaque. So we'll be able to see through where there isn't cloud. And for now, let's just create a base color parameter, and we'll set it to white. So if we go to press V on your keyboard and select here, or left click I should say, and we'll call this mist color. Plug it in to the base color and then just double click and drag it up to make it completely white. Okay, and that will probably suffice for now. You can see it's white in the preview here, so save that. Leave it open though, because we're going to come back and create our proper mist material in a moment. So back here, we will go into our materials folder again, and this time right click on your material and create a material instance. And we're going to call this mi_planar mist. And if we open that up, you'll see that it has a mist color parameter, and as we add new parameters to our material, we will see them there. So again, leave that open for now, maybe save it. And the last thing we want to do is we want to create a plane in our landscape that we can use to show the mist. So go to the add option here, shapes, plane, and drag it in over the lake. And then we need to change the scale here. So in the scale, change it to 20 by 200. And then let's rotate it on the y-axis by 90 degrees. Okay. And then we can just drag it up, drag it forward, and then let's just rotate it around a bit so it's sort of facing towards the camera. And again, just bring it a bit closer. So we can adjust this later on. Maybe I'll just raise it up a bit. You can see where it just goes into the water. So let's just put it down so it just goes into the water. So, and again, let's just rotate it slightly again, make it slightly flatter. I've got snap on here, so you may need to turn that off, but that will probably do. So you can see that it is sort of covering this band between the trees and the top of the trees there. And we'll rename that plane. We'll call it a planar mist, and we will put it in our cloud mist fog folder. Okay, so let's apply the new material to this plane. So if you go down to, in the details, to the materials and type mist and we want our material instance, MI Planar Mist, and select that. And let's go back to our material now, and let's change the opacity. So for now, let's just make the opacity a constant value of 1. So press 1 on your keyboard and left click, put that into the opacity, and let's change the value to 1. Click save. And I can't say at the moment, that may be because our plane is facing the wrong way. So go to the rotation and try making it -90. Yeah, and now you can see that it was just on the wrong side. So we'll rotate it round, and let's bring it a bit closer as well. So it's just up to that tree. So now you can see there's the sort of a fully white plane here, ready to create our mist material. So let's go back to the main material. Now there's going to be 3 components to our mist. The first one is the color, which we've done. The second one is a mask, or a moving mask or texture that will emulate the clouds or mist using noise and move it through the UV space, so it looks like it's actually drifting through the landscape. And then the third element is a radial mask, so you don't get sharp edges on the plane. We want to create a sort of a circular feathered mask so that you don't see where the mist ends on the plane. So as I said, we've done the mist color here. So next thing we need to do is create the the texture of the cloud. So let's start building that up. First of all, let's create a new texture parameter. So do T, get a texture sample, and the texture I'm going to use for this is tiling noise 05. You can try different noises later on, but this is one I'm going to go with to start off with. And what I will do is I will take the output of here on the RGB, do a multiply, and multiply it by the mist color. So let's actually do it that way around and plug that into the base color. Let's click save. And if I go back to my plane, you can see I've now got a sort of a wispy texture, but it's not moving and it doesn't have control over things like the opacity. So what I'll do now is I'll actually drag these out and I'll put them on the right hand side. And this way we can, as we make changes, we can see how they affect the mask over here. So I'm just going to zoom in slightly over here. And next thing I'm going to do is I am going to first of all create a panner for the texture so that it moves in the UV space. So to do that, I right click, choose panner, plug that into the UV coordinates, and we need to again get our texture coordinates, which we can do by pressing U and left clicking. So I get our texture coordinates, and we want to have control over the tiling of these coordinates so we can make the texture larger or smaller. So to do that, we will do a multiply, and we will create a parameter, which we can do by pressing S and left clicking, and we'll call this mist tiling, and we'll set that to a default of 1 and plug that into the multiply for the texture coordinates. And the other thing the panner takes in is a speed. So this is our coordinates, our tiling. Our speed will determine how this texture moves, how fast this texture moves. And we can do a speed in 1 axis or 2 axis. It's a vector 2. So let's actually do 2 parameters. So let's duplicate this mist tiling twice. And we'll call the first one mist speed X. And we'll set that to 0.01. And the other one mist speed Y, and we'll set that also to 0.01 as a default. And then what we'll do is we'll append these together to create our vector 2 and plug that into the speed. And I don't know if you can see in the preview, but we now have a slight moving texture here. So let's save that. And in our viewport over here, you can see that the mist is now moving across the lake and the top of the textures. But it is, we want a bit more control over the opacity of this. So the way I'm going to do this is to create a cheap contrast control from the texture sample so that we can adjust the opacity. So let's move this over a little bit. Let's remove this. And let's do our cheap contrast. Let's create a new parameter, so S and click, and we'll call this mist contrast, and we'll set that to a default value of 1. Put that in here. And then what we'll do is we'll actually plug this into the opacity. So we won't plug it into the color. We'll just have the color as 1, and then we'll use the texture to dictate how opaque it is. So black will be fully transparent, and white will be will block the white light. So you can see now we have those patches of transparency in there. So let's click save. And now we've got a much sort of better view in our plane here, and we can start to change things like the contrast and the speed. So if I go to the MI Planar Mist over here, select the parameters we've got, you can see that we can change the contrast. So that's a very sharp edge. And then if I reduce it below 1, it starts to get more wispy. So I'll leave it at 1 for now. And we can also change the tiling as well. So we can double the tiling, and you see you get more clouds. Or you can reduce the tiling just to get the occasional cloud there. So let's go back to 1 here. And let's actually make the speed slightly different. So if I make the mist speed X 0.02, you can see the clouds are drifting up slightly. Okay, so what we'll do next is we'll actually change the tiling so that I can tile differently on the U and the V plane so that we can squish and stretch the clouds. So let's save that. Go back to our tiling, and what we'll do here is we'll create 2 tiling parameters. So let's move this down a bit here. Let's call this first one mist tiling U. Then we will duplicate it with Control D, and we'll call this one mist tiling V. we'll need to append these together. So drag out here and append, put them together to create a vector 2 and plug it in here and save. So now in our material instance we now have two tiling controls. So if I change the mist tiling V, maybe I'll make it twice the tiling on the V axis, you can see that we are making these tiles more square, and if I then reduce them on that axis it stretches them out. So it depends what effect you're looking for. So let's leave them both as one for now, and let's comment what we've done so far. So this whole section here I'm going to call, so I'm going to select around it, press C for comment, and I'm going to call this mist moving texture. So we made a good start here. The next thing I want to do is I want to mask this texture so that it doesn't end abruptly at the end of this plane. You can see if I look around, you can see the edges of it here. So what we'll do is we'll create a gradient, a radial gradient that we can apply to this, so it will feather the mist from the center of this plane, and by the time it reaches the edge it will have faded out. So to do that, let's create a little bit of extra space here, and down here we'll create a radial gradient exponential. If I go in, you'll see it accepts UV coordinates, so we'll do U and left click, and we'll just put in the standard texture coordinates. So effectively the radial gradient will be tiled once across the whole plane, which is what we want. And the second thing which I'd like to control is the density of the radial gradient. So if I create a new parameter by using S and left clicking, I'll call this one mist density, and you can see the default here is 2.33, so I'll put in 3 as the default value and plug that in. So this is now a mask, so let's call this, comment this and call it radial mask, and to apply that we just need to multiply it by the output of our main texture. So multiply by the mask and then plug that into the opacity. And now if I click save, so I've actually plugged the density parameter into the radius by mistake, so let me just change that, hold control down and move it to the density and save that. And then if we go to our material instance, so let's start off with our mist density of 3, and you can see that it doesn't quite go to the edges here. So if I increase it up to 20, you can see that now clouds appear near the edge. If I reduce it to the default value, it softens them at the edge, and if I reduce it even more, they soften even more at the center. So again, with the combination of the contrast and the density, so let's put the density up first, reduce the contrast, maybe even more to create more of a mist, and then we'll reduce our density down. And you see that it's getting more wispy at the edge, and we get to a point where it's looking pretty close to what we want. The only last thing I'm going to do is that at the moment the mist appears directly along that plane. We can use a trick to make it, to push it into the distance and give it a sort of slightly 3D feel, and this is another form of mask. So let's save this, come back to our material, and what I want to do now is I want to add in here a depth fade. And what depth fade does is it uses the distance from the camera to points on the scene to decide where to show a material. So what we'll do is, you can see it's got an input of distance here, so we'll create a parameter S for the scalar parameter, and we'll call it mist distance. We'll have it as a default value of 0, plug it into our fade distance, and again we just need to multiply. So multiply here by this value and plug it into our opacity. And again we'll comment this and we'll call it distance fade. Click on save. So there shouldn't be any change at the moment because the value of 0 here for the depth fade won't make any change. But if we go slightly closer, you can see that the clouds appear to be in front of these trees here. Go to the material instance, and if you go to your mist distance and put in something like 10,000, you can see that it appears now to be behind that tree. So even though the plane is in front of the tree, it's using the camera depth to decide and to mask where it shows these. So as I said, it gives a sort of a pseudo 3D effect. So let's just do our last settings on our parameters here. So I'm going to leave the mist color as white. I'm going to turn the contrast right down to 0.1 so that it makes it very wispy here. Density I'm going to reduce to 2 so you can see through a bit more. I'll leave the mist distance at 10,000 and I'll reduce the speed down to 0.005 on the X, 0.02 on the Y, so it's just slightly moving along and up. And tiling wise, let's go with 0.5 on the U axis and 4 here so that we make them slightly squarer clouds. So you can see I now have this view that looks like there are light clouds sort of floating across the lake, and I can move this around now. So if I come back a bit so I can see the handles, I can bring it down, put it lower down in the lake so it just covers the area where you see the trees behind. And then let's just hide the plane highlighter so you can see what it looks like. And as I said, this sort of planar mist is perfect for cinematics because you're going to be placing the camera where you want and you're going to be looking directly on to the plane. And there's nothing to stop you creating multiple planes and maybe having different material instances as well, so you have clouds or mist that goes in slightly different speeds, slightly different directions, just to create a little bit more organic mist. I'm not going to do it in this particular tutorial, but by all means give it a go and see what results you come up with. So this planar mist is finished now. That's ready for cinematic use, but it's not really suitable for in-game use because it's too obvious when you're facing the wrong angle that it's a plane. So for game use we're going to use a volumetric mist, and let's go ahead and create that now. Before we create our volumetric mist, let's just switch off the planar mist that we just created. So select it here and go down to the rendering section to find visibility and just uncheck that because we don't want to see the planar mist on top of the volumetric mist. And let's start off in a similar fashion as before by setting up the material instance and the cube that's going to hold our mist on the lake. So to start off with, go into make sure that's switched off. Select your landscape, go into your materials folder, and we'll create a new material, and we're going to call this one M Volume Mist, and then right click, create a material instance, and we'll call this MI underscore Volume Mist. Open up your material by double clicking on it. Let's put that on the right hand side of the screen, and let's start off by setting up the material type. So this one is going to be a volume material, so in your material domain here, rather than surface material, change it to volume, and then in the blend mode again we want to make it an additive type here. And just like we started off with our planar mist, let's start off by having a parameter for color. So we'll do S to create a new scalar parameter. Sorry, not S, we want to do a color, so V for a vector, and call it mist color. Plug it into the albedo and set it to completely white. And you'll notice there isn't an opacity here. What we have is this extinction, and so the extinction dictates whether the volume fog appears or doesn't appear. So 0 shows nothing and 1 shows fog. So just for now, let's put a value with S, sorry, not with S, with 1, and click. Let's put a value of 1 so that we show fog everywhere that our material is applied, and click save. Now let's go back to here. Let's open up our material instance, not for planar mists, our material instance for volume mists. So at the moment it's only got one parameter here, the mist color, but we will come back and add parameters and change those later. Third thing we want to do is we want to add a cube to hold our fog. So on the landscape, let's zoom out a bit just so you can see sort of this side of the lake. And what we'll do is we will add shape cube and just drag it in over the lake. Let's just rename it to Volume Mist. And if you look at everything here, might need to just drag this so you can see everything. What we want to do is we want to change the scale here to 200 by 200 and a height of 5. You can see that it's dotted at the moment because it's underneath the water, so just use the move gizmo here to move it up until it's just above. You can see as I do that we're starting to see the cloud. Now at the moment we're seeing a white cube because it doesn't yet have our volume material on it. So if we, with our volume mist selected, if we go down to our materials and apply the volume mist, so we want the material instance, so MI volume mist, and it becomes completely invisible. So you might be thinking, well, hang on a second, we set our extinction value to 1, shouldn't there be fog everywhere in here? Well, yes, but it's driven by the settings in the exponential height fog. So you need to make sure that volumetric fog is switched on, and you also need to make sure that it has the right draw distance so that you can see it when it's far away. So let's select our exponential height fog, and if you go down in the details until you find volumetric fog, if you switch that on, you can see now there's a sort of a light fog in there. As I get closer, it becomes stronger, and that's because of the distance that the fog is drawn at. So a little bit further down here you'll see a view distance. So if we up that to 6,000 by default, if we up it to 20,000, now we can see the fog as we go up over the lake. But as you can see at the moment, actually you can see in the far distance it's starting to fade out as well. So let's maybe make it 30,000. Yeah. Okay, so now I can see it across the square, but it doesn't look very realistic at the moment because we've just got a value of 1 for the fog. What we need to do is we now need to create a moving texture for the fog. So let's go ahead and start to do that. So over in our volume mist material, let's take out our extinction value of 1 that we use just for testing purposes, and let's start to create the mask for the texture. So to do that, first of all we need our texture. So let's do T and do texture sample, and for this one I'm going to use Perlin noise. So here T Perlin noise came with the open land settings, and what we'll do is we will plug that, just the red channel because we're only really interested in black and white. We'll plug that into the extinction, and now we want to do a very similar thing that we did in the original planar mist and create sort of a panner and coordinate. So let's copy some of the stuff from that material, save having to set it up again. So go into your Planar Mist, and what we'll do is we'll copy all of this, all of the nodes from panner in front of panner. So Control C, go back to, you can shut that down, go back to your volume mist and place those in there. We'll plug our panner into the UVs, and let's just delete this at the moment because we need to do something different with our coordinates. So I'm happy with our the speed, having a mist speed X and Y, but we're dealing in three-dimensional space now for this because we're working on a cube. So what we'll do is we'll start off by getting the local position. So this is the local position of that cube, and we will then mask it. So component mask is what you're looking for, and we're just going to mask the R and G values, which are going to extract the X and Y coordinates. So we're only interested in the sort of top-down projection of this this cube, and then we're going to create some tiling. But to do that, we'll create a parameter. Let's use S to create a new parameter, and we'll call it mist mask size. Have a default value of 1, and we will use a divide to divide our object position by the mask size we want, and that will be our coordinates. Okay, and we will plug that into the extinction. Click on save. And let's see if there's any change on the viewport. You can see a little bit of pulsating, but that's probably because we haven't got the mask size correct yet, because we only set it to a value of 1. So let's go to our material instance. Let's check against all of our parameters. So let's change the mask size to the same scale as the that we set the cube to, which was 200 by 200. And now you can see that we see some gaps in that fog, but it's a very dense fog at the moment, and that's because the extinction value, even at sort of 0.5 and above, really makes the fog almost completely opaque. So we need to reduce the effect of our mask, and let's start doing that by dividing the output. So at the moment we've got values between 0 and 1. I want to divide it by 10 really to reduce the 0 to 1 scale here to 0 to 0.1. So let's drag out here and let's do another divide, and we'll divide by 10. Plug that into the extinction and let's save that. And now we can see that we've got much more transparent areas in our fog. But we still want more black values in here, and what we can do is we can use a power function in order to create more of an exponential curve between the black and the white value. So to do that, just create a little bit of space here. What we'll do is we'll put in a power node here. We'll plug that into our divide, and we'll have the exponent as a parameter. So if I use S to create a new parameter, and I'll call it mist power, and I played around with this and found a value of 4 was a good starting point here. So plug that in here. What it'll do is it will, instead of it being a linear line from 0 to 1, it will be a curve that's more on the black end. So the higher the value here, the more the curve will be biased towards the black side of the spectrum. So if I save here, you should see that this becomes more transparent. And there we go. We now have larger areas where there are no volumetric cloud. And I haven't actually shown you this yet, but if I go down, you'll see that there is a sort of thickness to this as you go through it. But once you're down at the sort of the low level, you can start to reduce some of the power in order to be able to see some of the wisps going on. So let's come back out here. Let me just move this back so you can see a bit more of it. If I pan out, we've still got a problem whereby you can see the edges of the cube. Just like we had in our planar mist, we want to create a softening mask that feathers it from the edges. Except this time it's not going to be a radial gradient because that was a 2-dimensional structure. We need to do this in 3 dimensions and create a sort of a sphere, flattened sphere in here. So let's just comment where we've got to here. So what I'll do is I'll go around all of these nodes other than the color, press comment, and I'm going to call this moving mist texture. And now we're going to work on the mask to create this sort of softened view. And it's slightly more complicated here because again we need to work in 3 dimensions. So let's start off by taking our, let me just tidy this up. So let's take our local position here and duplicate it down here. And then what we're going to do is we want to, so our position here, so this is a 200 by 200 cube. So our local position will be something like, if it was centered in the world, it would be sort of from -100 all the way up to 100. And what I want to do is I want to convert that into a range from 0 to 1, because ultimately I want to create a mask where 1 shows stuff and 0 doesn't show stuff. So to do that, we need to use something called local bounds, object local bounds. And what that does is that has some parameters to do with our object. So it has the minimum position and the size of it. So if we take our position and we subtract the minimum, we have now zeroed out the start position. So it will go from 0 to whatever the size of the cube is. If we then do a divide and divide it by the size of the object, we have now reduced it from 0 to 200, 300, whatever the size was, to 0 to 1. So actually let's comment that now, and we'll say convert object position to range 0 to 1. Okay, so at the moment this is going to mask things going from one side to the other. So let's just show you how this would work. If I do a multiply here and I plug the output of this into this multiply and then plug it into my extinction. Let's go around so I can see everything here. So if I save this, what you can see is that one side of the mask is still showing, and then it's sort of fading out as it gets to the other side. What we actually wanted to do is we want to fade it, but starting from the middle and fading out to the edges. So we need to do a bit more work, a bit more mathematical work on this mask in order to get the mask to show stuff in the center and feather it out. But we're almost there. So what we'll do now is we will take the 0 to 1 output, and we will use a useful node called a distance node. So you might have to scroll down until you find, you just want the utility distance here, and we need to plug in another parameter here. So use S to create a scalar value, sorry, not S, 1 to create a scalar value, and use 0.5 and plug that in. So what we're doing is we're plugging in the position from 0 to 1. So remember, we've normalized this, so 0 is at one end of the cube and 1 in it. In fact, this is in 3 dimensions as well, but if you think of it as just this is happening on the X, this is happening on the Y, this is happening on the Z, then you will sort of won't go too far wrong in understanding it. So 0.5 is our midpoint. If we work out the distance of the local normalized position from here, something that's at 0 will be a distance of 0.5. Something that's in the center point will be a distance of 0, and something at the far end, value 1, will be 0.5. So effectively we'll now get a range of 0 in the middle to 0.5 at all of the edges. So we want a range from 0 to 1. So let's now multiply by 2. So that creates our range of 0 and 0 to 0.5 back to 0 to 1. And if we plug that into our mask multiply here, you'll see that it's changed, but it's not quite what we want yet. Make sure I actually multiply by 2 rather than 0 and save, otherwise you'll get nothing. So now we have a mask, except it's not immediately obvious. We're still seeing the edges, but what's happening is that we are having the values of 1 at the edge and the value of 0 in the center, whereas we actually want it the other way around. We want 0 on the edge and 1 in the center point. And the way you invert masks in Unreal is to use a 1 minus node. So if you type 1 minus and then plug that in here and click save, you'll see that we can now no longer see the edges, although it's very faint at the moment. So let's up some of the other parameters so we can really see what's going on. Again, let's do a quick comment here. So around these nodes here, comment this and say create spherical mask, It's not actually spherical, it's a centered mask, but it's close enough. And let's add another parameter here. So as you see, it's very faint here. So let's do another multiplication. Let's just create up here just below the color. Let's create another parameter, S for scalar parameter, and let's call it mist opacity. We'll set it to a default value of 1, and we'll do a final multiplication here so we can control the strength of the extinction value. Okay, click on save, and then we'll start to change the parameters until we get the effect we're looking for. Okay, so I'm going to my material instance. I'll make sure everything's selected here. What I'll do is I will just drag it over so I can see a little bit more of the viewport. Right, so let's start off by upping the opacity. So now we've got that new parameter here. Let's put that up to 10 or even 20. So you can see now we see a very strong fog there. Now if I change the power of the fog, so if I make it double, you can see that it creates more gaps in between the material. If I reduce it, it creates more fog. So I'll leave it at the default of 4, and then let's just change a couple of parameters here. Let's just change the mist speed Y to 0.02 to create a slight difference between the X and Y coordinate. And let's see what it looks like if I go down to ground level. You can see that the edges are nice and soft now with our spherical mask, but if we go down to this sort of level, and actually I could probably raise it up slightly. So let's go to our volume mist and move it up. You can see, yeah, you can see where it is as I go up and down. So I'm going to drag it down so it's just above the lake. And you can see that once you're at this sort of eye line level, then it all accumulates together and creates one big mist. So we can probably now reduce the opacity quite a lot. So let's take the opacity back down to 3, maybe even 1 or 2. Yeah, 2 is probably right. So you can see that as I go through, I'm aware of fog or mist moving around me. Sometimes it obscures more, sometimes it doesn't. And again, you can play around with the power and the mask size. So maybe let's up the opacity to 3, and let's double the power so we have more gaps in between. So you can see that actually that's probably too subtle. Let's go back down to power of 4 here. Anyway, you can play around with this, but it's an effect that you can definitely use in game. You can put these mists patches, volumetric mist patches, wherever you like, and you can play around with the parameters to get exactly the effect you are looking for. So I hope you've found today's tutorial useful, and I'll be back with the next part of this series where we'll create a campsite scene in a few days. See you then.